I'm Andy Schmuckler, a man on a mission. This is a sort of a peripheral thing, but not a trivial one, having to do with the problem of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the struggles that institutions have been undergoing around those things during this Gaza period. You might say that it cost the head of the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the president of Harvard, both their jobs, but it goes beyond that there are issues about students feeling unsafe, and there are issues about people feeling like they've got a First Amendment right, and things also have ramifications in terms of inconsistencies in the kind of excesses of the culture in which people of certain categories get a special deal of protection, and people in other categories, like Jews, maybe don't get the same kind of protection under the law, as it were, in the institution as some other group that's more in keeping with the progressive point of view, like transsexual people or gay people or whatever. There are all these issues, but I don't understand the whole situation so well that I would want to address it. But I want to address something about the issue as it was recently presented in the New York Times, that the universities are having difficulty defining anti-Semitism. There was what was it, about Yale or something, or Columbia University. They issued a report in which they really needed to have some definition of anti-Semitism, but didn't really propose it. And there are sort of two different approaches, and one has been promoted by like Holocaust groups, and it's very encompassing, so that it's felt that criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism have a important degree of connection. And then there are people who say that no, the anti-Zionist thing is got to do with a position on a historical issue, and it doesn't have to do with anti-Semitism. And the political, the sort of leftist, from as I understood it back in the 60s and the 70s, the attitude toward Israel was very much one to see the Israel as a transplant, an imperialist European move, and so they were seeing it through the perspective of the whole European imperial thing. I think that that's fundamentally mistaken way of looking at it, but it isn't anti-Semitism. It's but the problem is that if you include anti-Zionism, sometimes there are going to be elements in the anti-Zionism movement that are really fueled by anti-Semitism and enter into it. It has seemed to me all my life that, well, I don't know all my life, that the international community has dealt with Israel differently than it would deal with other political entities that whose behavior was quite arguably a fair amount worse. And then there's also been the legitimate criticisms of how an Israeli the Israelis have navigated their existence. Now, I'll identify myself. I'm very strongly against some aspects of Israel that have been running Israeli relationship with the Palestinians. And these include cultural aspects, not the best things about Israel. And it includes, especially these days, political forces that embody some of the worst of Israel in terms of attitudes toward how to deal with the Palestinian issue. Now, I believe that Israel has a right to exist. In fact, it's the only national entity in the history of the world, I believe, that was created by the world community. So in terms of right to exist, I mean, I know the history of a lot of different countries because of having worked on the evolution of civilization on that book, The Parable of the Tribes. And I know almost everywhere you look on this planet, there are issues about who has right to that land. It's almost all stolen. And what the Israelis ended up with as the original lines was not really a case of anybody stealing from anybody back in 1947, 48, when the whole creation of a Jewish state came before the United Nations. So anyway, it's been a difficult situation. You can see that there are a lot of different things at work here, but I come down on the belief that when Israel came into existence as a Jewish state, given the totality of the picture, including legitimate rights to the land that had been purchased and developed and such, that it was the right thing to do. And the idea to me of if from the river to the sea means the elimination of a Jewish state in that region, which is, I think, what it means. I don't think that's justice. I think I have a friend who's knowledgeable about these things, who disagrees with me, who thinks I give the Israeli position too much weight. He and I did a radio show once where he, who like me is of a Jewish background, he and I disagreed about how to look at what happened at Camp David in 2000, when the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak laid out a plan that was very politically risky for him to lay out, because it gave the Palestinians a huge percentage of what the Palestinians had been saying that they wanted in terms of a Palestinian state. I felt that the history was that there had been a really serious offer, and that Yasser Arafat had walked away from it, demonstrating that the idea of actually negotiating with the Palestinians to come up with a two-state solution that was peaceful and provided security, that being the ultimate goal. I thought that Ehud Barak had gone a very far distance, far enough so that nobody on the Palestinian side should have ever walked away from it like Arafat did. It showed the bankruptcy of that approach that was being enforced by the Palestinians. But my friend, who actually knows a lot, and I wouldn't say he was wrong, he felt that that this offer, which gave the Palestinians 96% of what they wanted, that it wasn't really an acceptable offer. I think maybe it had to do with keeping Gaza and the West Bank from truly uniting or something. I don't remember the details, but he had a case about, that wasn't such a great offer. But I've been following this stuff for a very long time, and the beginning of my following world news like daily was when I was 10 years old and the Suez Crisis occurred in 1956. So there has been such a difficulty of getting the Arab world from the beginning to deal with the idea of there being this one little Jewish state in the region in a constructive way, accepting that that was going to be the outcome, which I say was a legitimate outcome, and not everybody agrees with that. And some people are anti-Zionist at that fundamental level. They don't believe that there should be any such thing as a Jewish state in this region that the Jews have that long ago history of, and that they came back and built something between the middle of the 19th century and then the middle of the 20th century, when a Jewish state is awarded in the wake of what happened in Europe, which is not irrelevant. I mean, Exodus, that Leon Uris novel, it's about the fight to establish Israel and the intersection with this boatload of people on the Exodus who are coming to this place because they have just survived the Holocaust. A lot of things going on, but all in balance. This was, I think, the better course, and but there is that element of right now. I am with the people who are anti-Zionist in regarding what Israel is doing. I am not anti-Zionist, but this particular government, well, Israel as a whole, I think has become a lesser, spiritually, intellectually, morally lesser thing than it was. That the experience between 1948 and the War of Independence there, all the way through to what Hamas has done, that the total experience of the Yom Kippur War and the 1967 war, and the assassination of Anwar Sadat, who broke ranks and started working toward peace with Israel. There's a lot of history there, and it's enough to make people kind of crazy. And I do think that there was a wisdom in Israel that was a stronger force than it is now. When I read that, even though I very much fault the Netanyahu regime for behaving in a disgraceful fashion in its response to the atrocities of Hamas. I mean, I think this was about as bad as it could have been, and a lot better combinations of ways of moving were available to an Israeli government. So I am ashamed that the Jewish state has acted in this way. And I was talking the other day to an Israeli friend of mine who came to this country in the early 1970s, and he's feeling so much like this is he's glad to be here and not there. But Israel still, for all of its being more broken than it was when the idealists from Europe came and established this very humanistic, very democratic society with ideals. And my aunt went to Israel in 1949 as a picture. It's my first time at an airport, this little plane she was going to fly off on. And she was this idealist that was going to go work on a kibbutz. Israeli idealism has contributed a lot of beautiful things to what Israel has become. Not just the kibbutzim, but the architecture of Jerusalem. I mean, there are visions all over the place. But I think that the spirit has contracted. I don't know. I don't know how much there is of that spirit but in any event, what's governing Israel now makes me feel very strongly aligned with the feelings of people who have been anti-Zionists in the past. But for me, it's just got to do with I want an Israel that behaves in ways that correspond to the real humane values that people like my ancestry worked to develop and then transplanted to this piece where there was that capability, that energy to take a desert and make it bloom. I mean, that was one of the, like, almost like a miracle that was being brought about in the desert. They're surrounded by desert, and this one place, the people have created a system that makes the desert bloom. I felt a lot of pride about that. I'm not a particularly tribal guy, but I know where I come from. Uh, I mean, I knew my father's parents that came over here from what was what would now be called Moldova, but it was still part of the Tsarist Russian regime. Uh, anyway, I visited Israel, and I went from having a basically pro-Israel view, just out of a certain kind of my sense of justice, and also my identification. Like Joe Biden identifies with Ireland. I don't know. It's probably not the same thing, but the one Jewish state, I wanted it to be admirable, and I appreciated that it was admirable in so many ways. The only democracy in the area, the only country where of all the Arabs throughout the whole region that made war on Israel, the only ones that ever had the right to vote were the ones who were Israeli citizens. I mean, there's a lot to celebrate there from that vision, but this Netanyahu government with bringing in that fascistic element so that Netanyahu could stay out of jail, a sociopath willing to sacrifice the good of the country because that's what it required to serve his own political interest, and who's probably perpetuating the war because he knows that if the war ever stops, he's going to get kicked out. I find that, as I said, I feel pretty ashamed of that. But to go back to the question of anti-Semitism, there is that element, and I think that there are a lot of things that have fed into anti-Zionism, so that it is true that that someone can be against Israel because they've got some view of the history of the thing, or they can be against Israel because they're, let's say, Arab Muslims, and they regard this as a particular affront to have an alien element in their midst, and it not being particularly connected with the fact that this element is Jewish. But there is this other element that I think we have to recognize is in there someplace because of the way Israel has been held to account, to the extent that other powers that are doing even worse things, not worse than what the Israelis are doing in Gaza the last couple of months, killing 30-some thousand people. I cannot quite imagine that whatever could be achieved by waging this kind of war would be worth killing 30-some thousand civilians. First of all, worth it in terms of there's got to be some proportion between, yes, sometimes civilians get killed in war, and important, worthwhile war game goals are achieved. I don't know what they're achieving in Hamas, with Hamas. Are they really destroying enough of what needs to be destroyed so that another October 7th can never take place? Is that sufficient reason, even if it were true? Well, But there are people who don't like the idea that the Arab world should have to yield anything to accommodate the legitimate claims also of Jews in that region. But there's definitely an odor here and there of there being a very ancient force that plays a role in singling out Israel for criticism and attack. I'm not sure why the students, the Jewish students on the campuses that we hear about, the protests making them feel unsafe, were they in fact unsafe? I gather that it wasn't necessarily irrational. So there's an energy out there which we can see in the history of Western civilization. We can see it in the Charlottesville. There's and the guy who goes into the Pittsburgh synagogue and shoots up everybody, and the 4 times as many anti-Semitic actions, attacks, incidents in the United States than there were back a ways. There has been something rising. I am interested in seeing this because I've got my own personal history, which is that I'm a baby boomer, born in '46, and sat around when we got together with the relatives, and I get to hear the people of an older generation talking about possible dangers of anti-Semitism that they see signs of, or it might be on the horizon. And I was kind of dismissive of that. It's kind of fun to laugh at myself somewhat because what was exposed in my way of listening to them was that I misunderstood the way the currents of history can work. That I believed that after World War II, the Holocaust, I mean, the world had a different way of dealing with it. They renounced anti-Semitism in the wake of the Holocaust. And I was brought up in that world where anti-Semitism had a bad name because it was associated with these death camps. But then came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Then comes a generation whose experience of the world doesn't include that anti-Semitic nightmare that Hitler and the Nazi regime unleashed. And then they see that Israel, which has been compelled by a hostile world to become sort of mighty Israel that's able to fight above its weight class, what this next generation gets to see is what happens when David becomes Goliath. And they never saw that Israel was in some sense, the historic David in this situation. They see a society that in 1967 is able to launch a preemptive attack that seizes land from Egypt and Jordan and Syria all at the same time. And comes into possession of this enormous bunch of territory that wasn't part of the original state of Israel that the United Nations had created. Well, that has proved a great temptation for Israel. It offered the possibility, I mean, prior to that, you might say that if Israel had been offered, okay, let's stop this conflict. Okay, you're going to be here. Let's see if we can make this work for everybody. That would have been great up to 1967. But then, after 1967, the Arab world is still saying no, no, no. The Israelis reach out to try to get something going to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, as it was called. And the Arab response was no to talk. There are three no's. Basically, it was giving Israel the finger, basically saying we are not going to come to terms with you. A state of war exists, and that left Israel unable to create something what they would have hoped to have in 1968 or 1948 when the country was. But they also now have a bunch of land that they control because of a war. And there are the issue of conquest. I don't know a lot of international law, but I gather that there are a bunch of rules that relate to territory that's seized through war. And the Israelis were in a difficult situation, which they ended up handling in a not very laudable way. They were in a difficult situation because they didn't have the opportunity to make peace at that point. And they were also occupying force that over a hostile people who also had genuine rights to their land, to be treated in accordance with the rule of law. And then the additional complication that 20% of the population of the old Israel, not expanded, are of the same nationality and religion, et cetera, as the people who have become an occupied people in occupied territories. And then you've got the element of not Zionism so much, because I don't think Zionism was into Judea and Samaria. The idea that God gave all this land to be Israel. A different, the Jewish version of from the river to the sea is this thing that has been a sort of messianic kind of Israeli force that not willing to make accommodation to the rights of other people because of the claim of such divine authority that God gave this land to us. Yeah, but we're all human beings. It's history that's given it to one group of people, taken it away from another group of people, undergone various permutations, and ending up in this thing. There's been a part of Israel that I don't like, and it's driven the settler movement, which I don't like. And American policy was always that settlements are an obstacle to peace, and I've agreed with that. So I'm very critical of Israel. I'm also compassionate with some of what they've been through to make them more broken than they used to be. But I also, having visited Israel, believe very strongly that there's something wonderful about the country. And that was beyond what I was expecting when I went to visit that. I, I would like to call your attention to a piece I wrote and published on that trip called Amazing Jerusalem. So if you Google my last name and read about Amazing Jerusalem, it was published in a couple of places. And it expresses something about the wonderfulness that I discovered in Israel that I wasn't really expecting. There's been a real blossoming of some aspects of the human spirit that's taken place in this society that made the desert bloom. A lot of things have bloomed, and that's why I grieve. I'm ashamed of a country that I've long been proud of, my tribe out there. The anti-Semite is one who is somehow carrying within him or her some kind of a cultural force that has a way of erupting in the society. I mean, for example, I've studied something about anti-Semitism. It is such a really astonishing history. I mean, being kicked out of England in 1215, being kicked out of Spain in 1492. The book, The Pity of It All, about the history of relationship between Jews and the rest of the German world from the mid 18th century all the way up to Hitler. There's something that is in the society, and I don't really understand quite how it works, but I believe it's got to do with the fact that civilized society has been structured by the force of brokenness to a very great degree all along. One of the consequences of that brokenness is that there's an intolerance in the culture of difference. There's an enforcement of sameness, orthodoxy. Being different is to be a threat in some way. And if you go back in European history, this is to the best of my understanding. I'll bet on this, but you'll find that there was a degree of homogeneity in European societies that was very considerable, as you would expect in a broken society, and that the only real other that was consistently there for the world to deal with the issue of difference on was the Jews. One of the things that is true about Jewish culture is that it found ways of making itself like a seed that is covered with a thick shell, and is able to be in the world, but maintain itself inside that world. And so while a lot of other things got absorbed by the expanding civilized world of from the time the Jews were kicked out of Palestine 2,000 years ago, not quite 2,000 years, till now. I mean, the way that the only people who were not of the one true church for some centuries were these clannish people who had found ways to seal themselves off and maintain their difference in the midst of a world. And if it's a world that doesn't like difference, then the one different group of people can come to embody a whole lot of stuff. And when you've got a broken world, you're going to have people who've got stuff in them that is because they're broken. They haven't integrated into themselves. So you find in bigotries that what you're dealing with is parts of the self that have been projected. I mean, there's a whole literature about how Black Americans or blacks to Southern whites have a certain set of meanings. That there's a projection that goes on of the parts of the self that have not been integrated, or as a way of enacting parts of the self that have not been integrated, so that Black people's sexuality becomes, a great threat through projection, and a lot of brokenness ensues from that dynamic. And with the Jews, I've been trying to understand. I mean, the Jew it stands in a different relationship with the bigoted society to the Black. The Jew is attributed all kinds of evil that is much more devious. Not the projection of the animal parts that the mainstream society has not done a good job of integrating, but a projection of the evil power that has actually inflicted wounds on a person in the process of socializing them. So you get somebody like George Soros appearing. I, who was brought up listening to my relatives that I didn't take seriously, didn't imagine that America was going to become a place where George Soros would play the role he's been playing for some years now, where the Republican world, which is to say the fascist world, uses George Soros as a way of plugging into this current that's been in Western civilization. That's, I don't really fully grasp how it works, but it is like it's proven that it is like the herpes virus that lurks in the system. You can get shingles, later in life, because the virus has been lurking in the system, and if you put the system under stress, the virus erupts or can erupt. Well, it does seem as though the period of time when I'm post-Holocaust, post the establishment of Israel, civil rights era, the advancement of the generations that had the children of the immigrants were becoming major figures in the wider culture, like Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and others, a role that gets played. And in my generation, Steven Spielberg. It's just been a huge success story, a dream come true for people who come from places where there were pogroms and have been able to make a meaningful life in a wonderful democratic society in which anti-Semitism, so I thought, wasn't going to be much of a force. I don't know what the truth is about how much anti-Semitism there was on these campus events. I'm just not knowledgeable about what was going on. Even if I had more knowledge, I wouldn't know necessarily how it all traces. But I think that when the New York Times article says that Columbia found that it couldn't really choose between this, that anti-Semitism has to take all these florid forms, or this, if you're against Israel, you're suspected of anti-Semitism. Uh, that really there's this an insoluble problem here. The truth is that, particularly in the circumstances of today, with what's been going on in Gaza, but even also further back when there are legitimate criticisms to have been had for a long time about what the Israeli government was doing to move toward a just and lasting peace and mutual security and maybe goodwill. I mean, that is clearly what good people are required to do. And Netanyahu has been in power a whole lot, and that is not what he's trying to do, and has never been trying what he's trying to do. That's why he turns out to have been supporting Hamas and cutting the Palestinian Authority, taking power and away from them and giving more of it to Hamas. That's part of what Netanyahu did in his sociopathic way. I really don't dig this guy. Any more than, in a way, I like him better than I like Trump, because he's at least intelligent in ways that I value and understand. But I don't like the spirit that moves this guy. And I don't know. I am not happy that Israel has not found a way to keep this sociopath from wielding power the extent to which he has. And yet it all sits on top of something which I also found to be wonderful. There's no way of disentangling all this. There are going to be, if the Israelis don't behave well, there's going to be anti-Israeli feeling in the world, and what they've done lately has magnified that greatly. The brokenness of this regime is so deep that I would bet heavily that what this government has done is the worst thing for long-term national security that they could have done. Excuse me. I think they've made the extinction of Israel eventually far more likely than it needed to have been in terms of how to respond to what Hamas did. It was clear that Hamas did this to set a trap for the Israelis, to have them do what they have done. There's no other way of interpreting what Hamas did. It's just the only way that the rational strategy makers on Hamas put this plan together very carefully. They wanted Israel to do what would make most probable the achievement of Hamas's long-term goal, which is the elimination of a Jewish state in that region. Palestine free from the river to the sea. Such is the brokenness of this Israeli government that they couldn't even get it together to figure out what the best thing was to do to serve the interests of the nation that they were guiding through a terrible crisis because of the unspeakable attack and horrific things that were done to their people by this group that has Gaza under its firm grip and has built a infrastructure underneath where millions of civilians live. Really difficult situation. But why would you just do what you know Hamas planned this whole thing to get you to do? What kind of consciousness is going on when it's crystal clear that that's what you want to do? So I don't mind people roundly criticizing Israel at this point. It's simply the unfortunate, the shameful moral truth of the matter. And I join in that. But I understand that there's other stuff that's been going on in this whole thing about the Jewish state, that the currents of anti-Semitism have always played some role in how all this has unfolded in terms of the way the United Nations condemns Israel for this and for that. This is not something entirely new, apparently, and there's no way of telling what the proportions are. So of course it's not going to be possible to identify. I think the solution is for the Israelis to become a nation that should get support from the rest of the world because of their wise and humane ways of navigating from a broken present into a whole future. And meanwhile, for the world to look at the elements of error and projection and brokenness that have informed the way European civilization, Western civilization, has dealt with the Jews over more than 1,000 years. There's no way of disentangling them. It's just got to be, well, we know it's all there, and find a way forward from that. Anti-Semitism is that thing that we know because we can see it in history and we can sense it in the present. But exactly what the boundaries are of it, who's to say? I can't. Thank you.